And so we meet the prophet Amos, whose ministry was during the reign of King Uzziah in Judah and King Jeroboam II in Israel. Amos announced the day of the Lord against the Israelites for the inhumane treatment of people, the mistreatment of the poor, the false pride in their wealth, and insincerity in their worship. This was during the golden age of peace and prosperity in Israel. So imagine, in Judah, sorry. So imagine that this was a message that the children of Judah weren't really willing to accept, because it seemed like they were flourishing. And here comes this prophet pronouncing doom and judgment on them. Now, Amos announced God's judgment on 6 neighbors of Israel and Judah who encircled them with the target for judgment on them. That's on Israel and Judah. The nations were Damascus, Gaza, Tyre, Edom, the Ammonites, and Moab. Now, even though they didn't worship Yahweh, they were still subject to his standards. God still expected baseline ethical and moral standards from them, which obviously they didn't live up to, hence the judgment. As for Judah and Israel, they were his people and in covenant with him. But because of that, they were held to even higher standards than their neighbors. They had forgotten the covenant promise that God had given them. And they had forgotten that covenant promise comes with responsibility, covenant responsibilities. They weren't immune to God's judgment, but they didn't seem to know that, because Amos's message was just not going down well. The 6 nations were guilty of cruelty, slave trade, treachery, harboring a grudge, murder, greed, and desecrating a corpse. For Judah, it was rejection of God. The judgment pronounced on all 7 nations was judgment in the form of fire. Israel's judgment was inevitable and also ironic, because Israel had their own separate chapter where God really went on a long list of all the things that they had done wrong. They sold people into debt slavery, oppressed the poor, ignored the afflicted, were sexually immoral, and did evil for their own pleasure, and most of all, they worshipped false gods. They faced God's judgment at the hands of invading nations, even though they believed that God would judge the wicked nations, but not them, because they were flourishing at the time. But they didn't know that God was going to use those nations to judge them. God had been patient with them and tried to correct them with famine, drought, mildew, plagues, and so on, but they didn't accept correction. Just like Pharaoh during the time of the Israelites stay in Egypt during the time of Moses. How ironic is it that things just seem to come full circle? Amos also wrote a lamentation, a funeral song over the house of Israel for failing to live according to God's love or law. There'd be ultimate destruction, but a tithe of the remnant will remain. That is 100 out of 1,000, then 10 out of the 100. So just a tithe of them would remain, but most of them would be destroyed. The people of Israel's perceived the day of the Lord as a day for victory for them. Like I said before, they believed that God was going to judge their enemies and not them. So when they heard the day of the Lord, they just heard, oh, the day that their enemies are going down and they are safe. But Amos corrected that misconception. On the contrary, their judgment will be greater because they received greater revelation. And it just reminded me of that saying that says, with much responsibility comes much. To whom much is given, much is expected. And that's what seems to be playing out right now for the Israelites. Now, here's what I learned about God from reading these first 5 chapters of Amos. In these chapters, God took ownership of the disaster over the nations. In 3:6, it says, if there's calamity in a city, would the Lord not have done it? Now, this was the 7th in a series of rhetorical questions raised by Amos, which reveal the events in history or nature and how they didn't happen without causes. But this question was answered. God had pronounced certain judgment. It's hard to comprehend why and how a good God will call for disaster. But we must know that he is a God of justice and must judge sin. If he doesn't judge his people, then he's not a just God. He's a partial God, and we all know that he's not. Most times, his judgment is delayed as he gives us time to repent because of his patience. God's judgment of his people is ultimately for restoration and not for ultimate judgment. He's a God of justice, but he's also a God of mercy. Thank you for joining me today. Tomorrow we'll conclude the book of Amos, reading chapter 6 to 9, and I look forward to seeing you here. Bye.